The rain fell in sheets of liquid steel, hammering the asphalt and washing the city's neon glow into shimmering, distorted rivers on the pavement. Kwon Min-jun felt the cold drops on the collar of his bespoke suit, a minor inconvenience in a world built of major ones. He walked alone, a deliberate choice. The solitude was a fortress, the rhythmic click of his leather-soled shoes against the wet sidewalk a metronome for the controlled chaos of his thoughts. His empire of shadows and whispers hummed along without him for these few stolen hours, a well-oiled machine of fear and loyalty. He preferred the rain to the sterile silence of his penthouse. The storm outside mirrored the one he perpetually carried within. It was then that he saw her, a small, huddled figure against the slick brick of a forgotten storefront. She was a smudge of gray in the vibrant, bleeding colors of the night, almost invisible. But he saw her. He saw everything. As he drew closer, the details sharpened with brutal clarity, the tattered gray wool of her shirt, soaked through and clinging to a frame that looked too fragile to withstand the wind, let alone the world. Her face was tilted down, hair plastered to her skin, but as a shadow fell over her, she looked up. Her eyes, wide and dark, held a terrifying emptiness that was somehow also a desperate plea. He expected the usual words, the tired request for spare change, a litany of hardship he had heard 1,000 times. He was already reaching into his pocket, a reflexive act of dismissal. But the words that left her lips were not what he expected. They were soft, barely a whisper above the drumming rain, yet they struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Do you know anyone who wants a wife?" The question hung in the air between them, absurd and heartbreaking. It was a query so far removed from the realm of possibility, so deeply steeped in desperation, that it transcended begging and became a strange, raw form of prayer.
Mignonne's hand froze.
The world, for a beat, fell silent. The rain, the distant sirens, the hum of the city, it all faded away, leaving only her question and the profound, aching vulnerability in her gaze. He saw not a beggar, but a soul at the absolute precipice of annihilation. And in that moment, something shifted in the cold, calculated fortress of his heart. He saw a different kind of fight, a different kind of survival, one that his power and wealth had never truly had to contend with. He slowly withdrew his hand, empty, and began to unbutton his heavy cashmere overcoat. He said nothing, simply draped the cavernous warmth of the coat over her shivering shoulders. The garment, worth more than the entire block they stood on, swallowed her small frame. She flinched at the sudden contact, at the scent of cedar and clean linen that was so alien to her world of damp concrete and decay. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, a mask of carved granite. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategy and threat assessment, was strangely quiet. This was not a problem he could solve with violence or money, not in the usual way. This was something else entirely. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the sound of the storm. Get in the car, a black sedan, impossibly sleek and silent, had pulled up to the curb, its engine a low purr. The rear door was opened by a man who moved with the silent, coiled grace of a predator. This was Kang Dae-ho, his shadow, his most trusted instrument of will. The woman, Anaya, clutched the heavy coat around her, her eyes darting from Min-jun's impassive face to the yawning, luxurious interior of the vehicle. Fear warred with a sliver of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She had thrown her last, most desperate prayer into the void, and the void had answered with a silent man in a perfect suit and an offer of shelter from the rain. Taking a ragged breath, she nodded. Dae-ho escorted her into the car with a detached professionalism, his touch light but firm, ensuring she was settled before closing the door with a soft, definitive thud that sealed her off from the world she had known. Min-jun slid in beside her, the scent of rain and damp wool now mingling with the polished leather. He gave a quiet order in Korean to the driver, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the rain-swept corner and her old life behind. Anaya stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the passing world. She was warm for the first time in days, but the cold inside her was a deep, unyielding glacier. She had asked for a husband. She had received a king of shadows instead. The apartment was not the opulent penthouse she might have imagined, but a minimalist sanctuary of glass, steel, and muted tones. It was high above the city, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a sprawling tapestry of lights that seemed to mock the darkness below. It was a place of profound silence, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the streets. Minjun led her into the space and gestured vaguely towards a hallway. "There is a guest room. You can shower. There will be clothes." His words were clipped, functional. He was a man who dealt in directives, not comforts. Anaya clutched the collar of his coat, the fabric a tangible link to the moment her reality had fractured. "Why?" she whispered, the single word holding the weight of her confusion and fear. He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond cold control in their depths, a shadow of a memory, a resonance of some old pain. "Because no one should have to ask a question like that in the rain," he said, the statement delivered as a simple, undeniable fact. He then left her, disappearing into another part of the apartment, leaving her alone with Daeho, who stood like a statue by the door, his presence a silent promise of security and a stark reminder of her captivity. An older woman arrived shortly after, her face etched with kind lines and her movements efficient and gentle. This was Mrs. Kim, the keeper of Minjun's private world. She spoke to Anaya in soft, halting English, her Korean accent a warm melody. She led Anaya to a bathroom that was larger than any room she had ever lived in and laid out a simple set of clothes, a soft cotton shirt and pants. The act was so mundane, so nurturing, it almost brought Anaya to tears. After a long, hot shower where she scrubbed away days of grime and despair, she emerged feeling raw and exposed. Mrs. Kim was waiting with a tray. On it was a steaming bowl of soup, rich with a scent of ginger and scallions. Anaya ate slowly, the warmth spreading through her, a fragile truce with a cold that had taken root in her bones. For the next few days, this became their rhythm. Minjun was a ghost, often absent, and when he was present, he was a silent, brooding figure, observing her from a distance. The questions he didn't ask were louder than any interrogation. Daeho remained her stoic guardian, always present but never intrusive. He would leave a book on the table for her or change the music to something softer if he noticed her flinch at a harsh sound. It was Mrs. Kim who provided the human touch, her quiet presence and nourishing food a constant source of comfort. She would hum traditional Korean lullabies while she worked, filling the sterile apartment with a sense of home Anaya had never known. The trust was not built with words, but with these small, repeated acts of safety. The promise of a locked door. The certainty of a warm meal. The absence of threat. In this quiet, protected space, the tight knot of terror in Anaya's chest began to slowly, tentatively, unwind. One evening, Minjun found her sitting by the window, staring down at the city lights. She had a sketchbook and a piece of charcoal in her hands, a gift from Daeho, but the pages were empty. She hadn't been able to draw for years. The creative impulse had been one of the first things her fear had extinguished. He didn't speak, just stood a few feet away, his presence filling the room. The silence stretched, no longer tense, but expectant. Finally, she broke it, her voice soft. "He told me I was worthless without him." She didn't need to say who he was. The word was heavy with menace. Minjun's posture didn't change, but a stillness settled over him, an intense focus that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He said my art was a child's mess. That my thoughts were foolish, that my body was the only thing I had of value, and that even it was on loan from his generosity. Her words came out in a slow, painful trickle, each one a confession of a theft, the theft of her confidence, her spirit, herself. I tried to leave, so many times, but he had eyes everywhere. He would find me, and he would smile that smile, and he would tell me how much he missed me, how he couldn't live without me. And then he would remind me what happened to the last person who tried to help me leave. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes clear with the terrible lucidity of remembered trauma. I ran with nothing. I knew he would find me eventually. I thought if I was married, if I belonged to someone else legally, It would be a cage he couldn't open. I wasn't asking for a husband. I was asking for a wall. A shield. Anything to put between him and me. Minjun listened to every word, his face an unreadable mask. But inside, her story was striking chords of a buried past. He knew this kind of evil, the kind that masqueraded as love, that suffocated with a smile. The kind that broke a person from the inside out. He had seen it destroy his own family. He walked over to the window and stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. He looked down at the city, at the millions of lives playing out in those pinpricks of light. "What is his name?" he asked, his voice a low, cold whisper that held the chilling promise of a coming winter. "Marcus Thorne," she said, the name a poison on her tongue.
Minyon nodded slowly.
"He will not find you here," he said. It was not a reassurance. It was a vow. "And he will never touch you again." The first sign of trouble was subtle. A bouquet of white lilies, Anaya's favorite, delivered to the building's lobby. There was no card, but none was needed. The message was clear. "I know where you are." Daeho intercepted the delivery, his face grim as he disposed of the flowers as if they were a biohazard. Anaya saw them from the window, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The scent of them, once a comfort, now smelled like a funeral. The sanctuary Minjun had built began to feel like a cage again, its walls closing in. A few days later, a man in a tailored suit tried to gain access to the penthouse floor, claiming to be a courier with a personal delivery for Anaya. The building's security, handpicked by Minjun, politely but firmly turned him away. Daeho reviewed the security footage, his jaw tight. The man was one of Marcus Thorne's associates. The threat was no longer a ghost. It had a face, and it was testing their defenses. Anaya retreated into herself. The sketchbook lay forgotten. She stopped eating the food Mrs. Kim so lovingly prepared. She would spend hours staring at the door, her body coiled in anticipation of a knock that would signal the end of her brief reprieve. Minjun saw the light in her eyes dimming, the fragile progress she had made shattering like glass. He saw the way her hands trembled when the elevator chimed, the way she flinched at the sound of a closing door. He saw Marcus Thorne's shadow reaching across the city, its tendrils of fear creeping under the door of his fortress. The external threat was escalating, but the real damage was happening inside, to her. One night, he found her curled on the sofa, wrapped in his coat, the one he had given her that first night. She was asleep, but her rest was fitful, her brow furrowed with the effort of fighting nightmares. He stood over her, the protective instinct that had stirred in him that rainy night now roaring into a cold, focused rage. This was not about business. This was not about power. This was about a promise. He had vowed that Marcus would never touch her again, and that included these invisible, venomous wounds he was inflicting from afar. He turned and walked to his study, the room where he commanded his empire. He picked up his phone and made a call to Mr. Choi, his lawyer, a man who could weaponize the law with surgical precision. "I need you to find everything on a man named Marcus Thorne," Minjun said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Every asset, every liability, every private vice, every legal vulnerability. I want to know where he breathes, where he sleeps, and where he hides his secrets. I want the architecture of his life so I can tear it down, stone by stone." The vow he had made to Anaya became his singular focus. It was a quiet, methodical declaration of war. While Daeho reinforced the physical security around the penthouse, turning it into an impregnable fortress, Minjun and Mr. Choi began the systematic dismantling of Marcus Thorne's existence. Mr. Choi, a stern man with eyes that missed nothing, was brutally efficient. He unearthed a history of shady business deals, leveraged assets, and a carefully constructed facade of wealth built on a foundation of debt and intimidation. Marcus Thorne was not a king, but a parasite who thrived by attaching himself to others. Minjun used his vast network of contacts to apply pressure. A crucial line of credit for one of Thorne's ventures was suddenly recalled. A lucrative contract he was about to sign was mysteriously awarded to a competitor. Business partners who had once flocked to his charismatic charm now avoided his calls, warned away by quiet whispers in the right ears. Each move was precise, untraceable to Minjun, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Marcus's world was beginning to crumble, and he didn't even know who was holding the hammer. During this time, Minjun's demeanor with Anaya softened. He began to join her for the meals Mrs. Kim prepared, sitting with her in a comfortable silence that was more companionable than any forced conversation. He would watch as she hesitantly picked up the charcoal again, her first marks on the page tentative and shaky. He brought her a small, potted orchid, its delicate white blossoms a stark contrast to the cold steel of the apartment. He told her it needed care to survive. It was a simple gift, but the symbolism was clear. He was tending to her, giving her the safety and stability she needed to bloom again. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling below, she looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "You're doing something, aren't you?" she asked. To him, he didn't deny it. He simply met her gaze and said, "I am keeping a promise." There was a finality in his tone that left no room for argument. He was her shield, and he would not fail. The retaliation was not a storm of violence, but a slow, creeping ice age, freezing Marcus Thorne out of the life he had so carefully built. It was a demonstration of a different kind of power, not the brute force of a street thug, but the inexorable, crushing weight of a glacier. Anaya felt the shift. The phantom scent of lilies faded. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of security that felt both foreign and deeply welcome. She was beginning to understand that the wall she had asked for was not made of stone or law, but of the unshakable will of the man sitting across from her. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a dark alley or a boardroom. It was in a place of Marcus Thorne's own choosing, the lobby of a five-star hotel where he was desperately trying to salvage a failing deal. He thought he was meeting a potential investor. Instead, he found Kwon Min-jun waiting for him, sitting alone in a plush armchair, a cup of tea steaming gently on the table beside him. Marcus's charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he took in the sight of the man before him. He didn't know who Min-jun was, but he could sense the aura of absolute power that surrounded him, as palpable as the chill from a block of ice. "Mr. Thorne," Min-jun said, his voice calm, almost pleasant. He gestured to the chair opposite him.
Please.
"Sit." Marcus, recovering his composure, sat down, his mind racing. "I believe there's been a mistake. I was expecting someone else." "There is no mistake," Min-jun replied, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. He slid a single, thick folder across the polished table. "This is a comprehensive summary of your life. Your real life. The shell corporations. The defaulted loans. The two families in different states who think you're a traveling consultant. The sworn affidavit from your former business partner detailing your fraudulent activities. It is all there." Marcus's face went pale. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice a choked whisper. Min-jun leaned forward slightly, the intensity in his gaze sharpening to a razor's edge. "I am the man who heard a woman's prayer in the rain." "A prayer you caused." The recognition dawned in Marcus's eyes, followed by a wave of pure terror. "This was not about business. This was about Anaya. She is under my protection now," Min-jun continued, his voice dropping to a deadly soft murmur. "Every asset you have is frozen. Every line of credit is cut. Every friend you thought you had has been warned away. Your life, as you know it, is over. The world you built for yourself no longer exists." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You have two options. You can take the small emergency fund I have left for you in an offshore account and disappear. You will go somewhere far away, and you will never contact anyone from your old life again. Or you can stay. And this folder," he tapped it with a single finger, "goes to the federal authorities. And I assure you, they will be very interested in its contents." There was no negotiation. There was no rage. There was only the calm, unassailable certainty of a predator who had its prey cornered. Marcus Thorne, the man who had built his life on manipulation and control, was utterly and completely broken. "You will never see her again," Min-jun said as a final, chilling command. "You will not speak her name. You will not even think it. As of this moment, Anaya does not exist in your world." He stood up, leaving the folder on the table. "The choice is yours. But I would advise you to choose wisely." Without another glance, Kwon Min-jun turned and walked away, leaving Marcus Thorne alone with the ruins of his life. With the threat of Marcus Thorne permanently excised, a profound quiet settled over the penthouse. It was a silence no longer laced with fear, but filled with the possibility of peace. Mr. Choi worked diligently to erase the last vestiges of Anaya's old life, securing a legal name change and creating a new identity for her, one that was untouchable and untraceable. The legal documents were a formality. Her true freedom had been won in that hotel lobby. The change in Anaya was gradual, but remarkable. Color returned to her cheeks. She began to fill the pages of her sketchbook, first with abstract shapes and lines, and then with tentative drawings of the city skyline, the orchid Minjun had given her, the kind face of Mrs. Kim. Her art was returning, a fragile green shoot pushing its way through scorched earth. Minjun found himself seeking out her company. He would come home from his demanding, often brutal, work and find solace in the quiet space she occupied. He watched her draw, fascinated by the way her hands moved, creating beauty from a blank page. He listened as she began to talk more, not about her trauma, but about small things, a book she was reading, a piece of music she liked, a memory from her childhood before her world had turned dark. He, in turn, began to share pieces of himself. He told her about his mother, who had loved to garden. He spoke of the suffocating weight of his father's expectations and the loneliness of his position. He never spoke of the violence that underpinned his empire, but he allowed her to see the man burdened by it, the man who sought refuge in order and control because his early life had been defined by chaos. One evening, Mrs. Kim prepared a traditional Korean meal, an elaborate spread of dishes that filled the apartment with savory, comforting aromas. As they ate, Anaya smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her entire face. "I've never felt this safe," she admitted, her voice soft. The simple confession struck Minjun more deeply than any compliment. Safety was the one thing he could always provide, the one currency in which he was truly wealthy. But to see its effect, to see it nurture a wounded spirit back to life, felt like a new kind of power, one that was restorative instead of destructive. The arrangement that had begun as a desperate plea in the rain was transforming. He was no longer just a protector, and she was no longer just a victim. They were two lonely, wounded people who had found an unlikely sanctuary in each other's presence. The shield he had offered her was becoming a home for them both. The proposal happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, with no fanfare or grand gestures. They were on the balcony, the city a glittering jewel box spread out beneath them. Anaya had been showing him a finished drawing, a portrait of the potted orchid, its blossoms rendered in exquisite, hopeful detail. He looked from the drawing to her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights, and he knew. He knew that the promise he had made to protect her had evolved into something far deeper, a desire to share his life with her. "You once asked me if I knew anyone who wanted a wife," he began, his voice steady and low. She looked up at him, her hand stilling on the page. "I have given it a great deal of thought," he continued, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "And I have concluded that I am that man." Anaya's breath caught in her throat. She searched his eyes for any sign of pity or obligation, but found only a sincere, profound tenderness that made her heart ache. "Not as a shield," he clarified, his gaze unwavering. "Not as part of an arrangement, but as a partner. I want to be the man you share your silence with, the one who watches you draw, the one who comes home to you. If you will have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, cathartic release. She had asked for a wall, and he had given her a fortress. Now he was offering her its key. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. Yes, the wedding was a small, private affair held in the penthouse. The only guests were the three people who had formed their unlikely family: Mrs. Kim, who cried quiet tears of joy; Kong Dae-ho, who stood with an uncharacteristically soft expression on his face; and Mr. Choi, who officiated with a solemn dignity that bordered on paternal. Anaya wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, and Minjun wore a dark suit, but he seemed less like a king of the underworld and more like a man who had finally found his harbor. They exchanged simple vows, promises not of fairy tale love, but of unwavering support, mutual respect, and shared sanctuary. When he slipped the ring on her finger, it was not a chain, but an anchor. Later that evening, after their guests had departed, Anaya led Minjun to her room. She opened a closet and pulled out a small, sealed box. Inside was the tattered gray wool shirt she had been wearing the night they met. She had kept it, a reminder of the abyss from which he had pulled her. Together, they took the box to the balcony's incinerator. As the flames consumed the last remnant of her old life, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The marriage had not been the end of a transaction, but the true beginning of their life together, a formal recognition of the family they had already become. In the months that followed their quiet wedding, the penthouse transformed from a sterile sanctuary into a warm, lived-in home. Anaya's art filled the walls, vibrant canvases of color and life that replaced the cold, abstract pieces Minjun had once favored. The scent of Mrs. Kim's cooking was now frequently joined by the smell of turpentine and oil paints, a combination Minjun found surprisingly comforting. Anaya, now secure in her safety and identity, flourished. She enrolled in online art history courses, her mind sharp and hungry for the knowledge she had been denied. She began working on a collection of paintings, a series that chronicled her journey from shadow to light, her pain and resilience translated into powerful, emotive images. A local gallery owner, a contact of Mr. Choi's, saw her work and immediately offered her a solo exhibition. She was no longer a victim hiding from the world. She was an artist, preparing to share her voice with it. Minjun found himself changing as well. The rigid control he exerted over his life began to loosen. He started coming home earlier, leaving the machinations of his empire in the capable hands of Daeho. He would spend hours in Anaya's ad hoc studio, simply watching her work, content in the peaceful, creative atmosphere she generated. He learned to differentiate the subtle shades of blue she favored, to understand the emotional weight behind a particular brushstroke. He was seeing the world through her eyes, a world of nuance, beauty, and feeling that his own life of stark, brutal clarity had long obscured. He taught her how to play Go, the ancient strategy game, and was consistently surprised by her intuitive, unconventional moves. She, in turn, convinced him to help her tend to a small herb garden she had started on the balcony. He discovered a quiet satisfaction in the simple, tangible act of nurturing life from the soil, his hands, so often used to direct acts of destruction, now tasked with creation. Their bond was forged not in grand romantic gestures, but in these shared moments of quiet domesticity. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of tea without asking, knowing exactly when he needed it. It was in the way he would place a blanket over her shoulders when she fell asleep on the sofa, her sketchbook resting on her chest. They were two solitary souls who had learned to weave their lives together, creating a tapestry of shared strength and gentle affection. The power he wielded outside their home remained absolute and fearsome, but within their walls, he was simply Minjun, a man who had found his peace in the presence of a woman who had once asked for a shield and had instead given him a home. One afternoon, Minjun returned home to find Anaya standing before a large, finished canvas. It was the centerpiece for her upcoming exhibition. The painting depicted a dark, rain-swept street, the neon lights bleeding into puddles on the ground. It was the corner where they had met, but instead of a huddled, desperate figure, there was only a single, heavy cashmere coat lying on the sidewalk. From it, a brilliant white orchid was growing, its blossoms luminous, pushing back against the oppressive darkness of the scene. The painting was titled Sanctuary. He stood beside her, looking at the powerful image, a visual representation of their entire story. It was a testament to her resilience and a tribute to the promise he had made and kept. He felt a swell of pride so fierce it almost took his breath away. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's honest," she replied, turning to him. Her eyes were clear and bright, free of the shadows that had once haunted them. "It's our story." The beginning of it, anyway. Later that night, long after the city had quieted, he found an old, ornate wooden box in the back of his closet. He brought it to the living room where Anaya was reading. He opened it for her. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was not a weapon or a ledger of his dark dealings, but a collection of dried, pressed flowers, and a handful of worn photographs of a smiling woman in a garden. My mother, he explained softly. She loved orchids. She believed they represented strength and resilience. The ability to find beauty in harsh places. It was the deepest part of himself he had ever revealed to anyone, the source of his own hidden trauma and his fierce, protective nature. He was sharing his own history of loss, entrusting her with the memory of the woman whose murder had set him on his path of cold, controlled vengeance. Anaya reached out and gently took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. She didn't offer empty platitudes or words of pity. She simply held his hand, offering her silent, unwavering presence, a mirror of the quiet support he had given her. In that moment, the last wall around Kwon Min-jun's heart crumbled. He was no longer just a protector, a boss, or a king of shadows. He was a husband, a partner, a man who had found his own sanctuary. Together, they looked out at the endless city lights, no longer two lonely souls against the world, but a family forged in the rain and restored in the quiet, unshakable warmth of their shared home.